Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Leo Fredholm, I'm talking about the 2011 album from Floex, Zorya. Alright then, it's finally time for me to start on the next run of Patreon requests, over 2 months after they all got sent in, because of course. And we're starting off with a particularly interesting one. Floex is the alias for Czech composer, producer, and clarinetist Tomáš Dvořák, sorry for butchered pronunciations as per usual, an artist known for his mixes of electronic and classical music. He doesn't have an especially extensive catalog. He only released one other proper album before this one, and hasn't released any other solo album since this was released in 2011. I guess if you count the album he did with Tom Hodge in 2018, there's that too. And he has kept busy with plenty of soundtrack work for video games and whatnot throughout the years. I'm told his soundtrack to Machinarium was a pretty common starting point for people getting into him, but that's about it. And even with the small amount of work he's put out, he's already got a pretty dedicated following. I haven't heard anything else he's done outside of this album, aside from the remix of Orbital's The Girl with the Sun in Her Head that he contributed to their 30-something compilation. He definitely had one of the biggest standout remixes in that comp, so I was mildly intrigued by what he had to offer here. This kind of album is exactly the kind of thing that I like to run into for Patreon requests. The kind of thing that wouldn't fit being highlighted in a proper series, what with how little work he has to his name, but also the kind of thing that might deserve more dedicated coverage than maybe some random Some Stuff I Missed segment. And I may as well not beat around the bush on this album. I absolutely loved it immediately from first listen. This may very well be the best album that I first discovered through one of these paid requests to date. I have been sitting with this project on and off for the past several weeks, and 8 listens later, or however many I've given it at this point, it still hasn't gotten old. I think it's legitimately excellent, and if I'd known it existed before, I could have put it very high on my retrospective year-end list for 2011. This album explores such an interesting and well-detailed mix of electronic, classical, and jazz stylings, mixing crunchy and evocative IDM beats and glitch work with lots of pianos and clarinet performances, full acoustic ensembles with trumpets and strings and more. It's so instrumentally dense, but also primarily aiming to hit on a much more straightforward and visceral emotional level as well. I got the same feeling putting this on for the first time that I did when I first put on that Fullgrap album that got requested of me a few years ago. And it's even more directly up my alley than that was. This thing is like perfectly designed to appeal to someone with my particular musical tastes. Right from the way this thing starts with opener Ursa Major, you're first hit with about 30 seconds of ambient build-up, some subtle pads, reversed pianos, a single dramatic bass stab, and then this extraordinary pretty piano loop starts up and pulls me in pretty much immediately. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Even before the crunching and noisy abstract IDM beats and the various bell noises start joining in as well, or all the undulating layers of wavy synths in the second half paying off into a neat outro of airy, wordless female vocals, pretty much sold me on this project right away. But the quality continues on that same level through most of the rest of the project as well. The first track is immediately topped by the next cut, Casanova, which focuses on a jazzier 5/4 groove that I think combines some acoustic and electronic drumming. Also, the first cut to primarily feature Dvořák's clarinet performances, going over lots of evocative layers of synth textures, some that sound like twinkling bells or chopped up vocals, and of course there's the trumpet solo in there as well, in this one section where the chord progression shifts into this super dramatic descending bridge, or a whole buildup of noise near the end which gets particularly epic. I mean, goddamn, every 15 seconds of this track seems to have something new to notice, and it just keeps my attention completely riveted. And most of the other tracks on the rest of the album are able to deliver on the scale and instrumental density of these first 2 tracks. Some cuts have more of an energetic bend to them, like Veronika's Dream. The breezy acoustic drumming and later distorted synth builds have a lot of bounce to them, and it's also hitting you with a lot of mysterious string sections and piano progressions that have a particularly whimsical energy to them, but are also colored with a mild sense of dread, like watching someone being chased by some kind of ghostly apparition in an animated movie. I think if I had to mark one cut as my favorite here, it'd be that one. And of course there's also the longest cut here, Forget Me Not. Once again, there's plenty to pay attention to here, with lots of clanging acoustic drums going up next to various blips and blocks of synths. Some parts give me mild John Hopkins vibes. Also hitting you with lots of low-pitched shakuhachi, bright horn sections, and some neat wordless female vocal lines near the end to add some more present melody. That one's pretty commonly highlighted as many people's favorite cut here, and I can definitely see why. Though, for whatever reason I have not been able to fully pin down, this was also a point in the album where my own attention would consistently trail off a little bit. I guess because it felt like a slight lowering of stakes in between two even stronger and more striking cuts, and maybe dragged on a tiny bit longer than it needed to, I don't know. It's still an excellent track, just slightly less of a standout for me than it appears to be for most people. Some cuts here fall on the lower key side and keep my attention even better. Petr, Parléř, or however you say that, takes on a more analytical approach to its IDM experimentations, with lots more micro-detailed sounds and glitches going up next to various blends of chopped-up electric piano, airy vocal pads and strings, maybe a bright little stab or two of the horn sections. This cut is like really directly hitting on some like BT, this binary universe type appeal, and especially reminds me of cuts of his like dynamic symmetry, which is only a massively glowing compliment there. And there's also the penultimate cut, Mecholup, which goes for another one of the more minimalistic arrangements, switching off between lonely sounding clarinet performances, some solo upright bass, later some melodic distortion effects, and some solo cello, all going over an extremely light synth loop in the background. It's a particularly quiet and melancholy cut, but definitely gets its subtler emotions to carry across quite effectively. But that's not even getting to the tracks that have full-on vocal guests who are worked in fantastically well. First there's Precious Creature, which hits you with one of the most energetic and striking instrumentals on display here, probably the most energetic cut in the bunch. Mixing a lively, bouncing IDM beat and triplet clarinet loops, occasionally paying off into more light noise buildups, some of the lusher string accompaniment, and an accordion outro. But all of this is mixed in with the somewhat androgynous voice of James Roan, who slots perfectly into the mix, giving the track a much more memorable and accessible chord, tune, and melody to latch onto without distracting from the instrumental density. Fantastic. And the other track with a vocal guest is Nell Blue, featuring Musetta, I don't know. A much lower key cut, but still a particularly evocative standout all the same. First hitting you with some muted electric piano chords, going up next to thumping minimal acoustic percussion and vibraphones, until Musetta comes in, singing in what I think is Italian, and adding a particular melancholy and smooth jazzy tone to the whole mix that still has time to get especially dramatic and even kind of heart-wrenching, delivering the emotional grounding through its mix of thick synth bass, clattering IDM beats, and other synths. One of the biggest emotional highlights in the bunch. Now, none of this is to say I think this album is entirely perfect, and if there's one thing that I do take particular issue with, it's the inclusion of a handful of shorter interlude tracks peppered throughout the track listing in Blow Up, Perlin Noise, and the sort of title track and closer, Zorya Polunochnaya, or however you say that, sorry. These are obviously much shorter tracks and are easily the lowest key moments in the bunch. They mostly focus on solo piano or ambient pads in Perlin Noise's case. Brief breathers in between the bigger tracks surrounding them. And while again, all of them are very nice and pleasant and just as pretty as you'd want, I don't really feel like they added all that much to the overall experience. None of them were among the most emotionally evocative or interesting moments here, and they ended up kind of weighing down the pacing a little bit. Well, not so much Perlin Noise, which kind of just blends into the end of Veronika's Dream, but the other two often ended up feeling like they may have distracted from the flow of the album a little bit, especially the closer, which may start out with a nice bit of very low-key piano arrangement that would have been a nice way to cap off the end of the album, but tacks on 2 entire extra minutes that just sound like you're hearing the musicians getting up and leaving over some minimal ambient pads. That whole part really didn't need to be there, could have just left it as a minute-long interlude and left it at that. But whatever, that's everything on Zorya, and those relatively minor nitpicks aside, this was one hell of an impressive listen. This is an album that might not get brought up often, but gets a lot of hype from anyone who has actually heard of it, and I can pretty much confirm every bit of hype it does get. I was floored by this immediately. It's continued to hold up with the past couple of weeks of repeat listens and not get old. Every track, aside from the interludes, are so full of interesting details and instrumental flares that you keep noticing new things every time you put it on. I'm kind of at a loss for words. It's the kind of album that I had, like, writer's block with for a while because I just wanted to keep listening to it instead of actually writing about it. I've already had a much better feeling about this upcoming run of Patreon requests than I did for last year's run, and this is one hell of a way to start. I am definitely hanging on to this one. I'd absolutely recommend checking it out yourself if you haven't heard it already. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.